When we begin a conversation about losing 10 kilograms in 30 days, the first instinct for many people is excitement mixed with urgency. That urgency, however, is exactly where most mistakes begin. The body is not a machine that can be forced into submission without consequence. It is a highly adaptive system, governed by biological intelligence and psychological patterns that resist extremes. So before we talk about diet plans or exercise routines, we need to establish something more fundamental. What does it actually mean to set a goal that is both ambitious and responsible? A realistic goal is not one that limits your potential. It is one that aligns your ambition with how the human body truly works. Rapid weight loss is possible, yes, but the method determines whether you are losing fat, water, or even muscle. And if the process is careless, what you lose physically, you often regain psychologically. This is where many individuals fall into a cycle. They chase quick results, impose extreme restrictions, and then experience an equally extreme rebound. It is not a failure of willpower, it is a failure of strategy. From a physiological standpoint, the body is designed for survival, not aesthetics. When you drastically cut calories or overtrain, your system interprets that as a threat. Metabolism slows down, hunger hormones increase, and energy levels drop. In other words, the body pushes back. A well-structured goal respects this reality instead of fighting against it. It creates a controlled deficit, encourages fat loss while preserving muscle, and allows the metabolism to remain stable enough to support consistency. But there is also a psychological dimension that cannot be ignored. When a goal is unrealistic, it creates internal pressure. That pressure leads to an all-or-nothing mindset. Either you are perfectly on track, or you feel like you have failed completely. This binary thinking is dangerous because it turns small deviations into excuses for abandonment. On the other hand, a realistic goal introduces flexibility. It allows room for imperfection while maintaining direction, and that is what sustains long-term change. Not perfection, but continuity. There is also a deeper philosophical layer to this. The desire to transform the body often comes from a desire to transform identity. People don't just want to lose weight, they want to become someone else, more confident, more disciplined, more in control. But identity does not shift overnight, and forcing the body into rapid change without developing the mindset to sustain it creates a disconnect. True transformation happens when your actions, beliefs, and expectations evolve together. A realistic goal acts as a bridge between who you are now and who you are becoming. This is why the number 10 kilograms in 30 days should not be treated as a rigid demand, but as a directional target. For some, it may be achievable. For others, the healthier outcome may be slightly less. What matters is not blind adherence to the number, but intelligent commitment to the process. When the process is correct, the results follow, and more importantly, they last. So instead of asking, how fast can I lose weight? A more powerful question is, how can I lose weight in a way that my body accepts and my mind can sustain? That shift in perspective changes everything. It moves you from desperation to discipline, from reaction to intention, because in the end, the goal is not just to lose 10 kilograms. The goal is to become the kind of person who no longer needs to lose it again. Once the goal is properly defined, the next layer is where most transformations are either built or quietly destroyed, and that is the daily act of eating. Not dieting in the dramatic, restrictive sense that people often imagine, but the quiet, repeated decisions that shape your body over time. Because what you eat is not just fuel, it is information. It signals to your body whether to store fat, burn energy, repair tissue, or prepare for scarcity. Many people approach food with a short-term mindset. They look for something to eliminate, something to cut out, something to fear. Sugar becomes the enemy, carbs become the problem, fats become suspicious. But this fragmented thinking often leads to confusion and inconsistency. A more intelligent approach is to shift from elimination to selection. Instead of asking, what should I avoid? Begin asking, what does my body actually need to function optimally? Whole foods answer that question with remarkable clarity. Foods that are close to their natural state, vegetables, fruits, lean proteins, whole grains, carry not just calories, but structure. They digest more slowly, stabilize blood sugar, and provide the nutrients required for metabolic efficiency. When you eat this way, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your hunger becomes more predictable, your energy more stable, and your cravings less chaotic. The body, when properly nourished, becomes easier to manage. Processed foods, on the other hand, are engineered for overstimulation. They are designed to bypass natural satiety signals to keep you eating beyond your needs. This is not simply a matter of discipline, it is a neurological response. Highly refined sugar, excessive salt, and artificial flavor combinations activate reward pathways in the brain in a way that mimics addictive behavior. So when someone says, "I just can't stop," it is not weakness. It is biology responding to an environment it was never designed for. This is why control is not about force, but about environment. If your daily choices are surrounded by options that work against your physiology, you will constantly feel like you are fighting yourself. But when your environment is aligned, when your meals are structured around real, nourishing food, the need for constant resistance begins to fade. Discipline becomes less about struggle and more about routine. Portion control also enters the conversation here, but it must be understood correctly. It is not about deprivation, it is about awareness. Most people do not overeat because they are hungry. They overeat because they are distracted, rushed, or emotionally disengaged from the act of eating. When you slow down, when you actually pay attention to your meals, something changes. You begin to recognize fullness, to distinguish between physical hunger and psychological craving. Eating becomes intentional rather than automatic. There is also a philosophical shift that occurs when you start to see food not as comfort, but as responsibility. This does not mean removing enjoyment from eating, it means elevating it. You begin to respect what you consume because you understand its impact, not just on your body, but on your clarity, your mood, your ability to perform. Food becomes less about momentary pleasure and more about long-term alignment. And this is where consistency is quietly formed, not through strict rules or rigid plans, but through repeated, conscious choices that reinforce a certain standard. You are no longer negotiating with yourself at every meal. You are simply acting in accordance with a system you trust, because ultimately, the question is not whether a particular diet works. Many diets work for a while. The real question is whether your way of eating is sustainable, whether it integrates into your life without constant friction. If it does, the results are not temporary. They become part of who you are. And that leads to a simple but often overlooked truth. You don't transform your body by controlling food occasionally. You transform it by understanding food consistently. Once nutrition is structured with intention, something even more fundamental begins to reveal its importance. Something so simple that it is often ignored precisely because it feels too obvious to matter. And that is water. Hydration is rarely seen as a strategy. It is treated as a background habit and afterthought, but in reality, it is one of the most quietly powerful regulators of how the body functions, especially in the context of weight loss. The human body is, at its core, a water-based system. Every metabolic process, fat oxidation, digestion, nutrient transport, temperature regulation, depends on adequate hydration. When water intake is insufficient, these processes do not stop, but they become less efficient. And inefficiency, when repeated daily, accumulates into stagnation. People often interpret this stagnation as a need for more extreme diets or more intense workouts, when in fact the issue may be far more basic. The system itself is undersupported. There is also a subtle but critical connection between hydration and hunger. The signals for thirst and hunger originate from similar regions in the brain, and they are often misinterpreted. What feels like a craving for food is, in many cases, the body asking for water. But because food is more immediately rewarding, people respond to the signal incorrectly. Over time, this misinterpretation becomes habitual. You begin to eat not because your body requires energy, but because it lacks clarity in its signals. When hydration is consistent, this confusion begins to resolve. Hunger becomes more accurate, more aligned with actual energy needs. This alone can significantly reduce unnecessary calorie intake without any conscious restriction. It is not about forcing yourself to eat less, it is about allowing the body to communicate more precisely. Water also plays a role in how the body manages energy. Mild dehydration can lead to fatigue, reduced focus, and a general sense of low motivation. And when energy drops, the natural response is to seek stimulation, often in the form of sugar or caffeine. This creates a cycle where dehydration indirectly drives poor nutritional choices. You are not simply craving sugar, you are compensating for a lack of internal balance. Replacing sugary drinks with water is therefore not just a caloric adjustment, it is a neurological reset. Liquid calories are particularly deceptive because they do not create the same sense of fullness as solid food. A single sugary beverage can add a significant amount of energy intake without reducing hunger later. When you remove these from your routine and replace them with water, you are not just cutting calories. You are restoring a more natural relationship between intake and satiety. There is also a behavioral dimension to hydration that is often overlooked. Drinking water regularly introduces a rhythm into your day. It creates moments of pause, small acts of awareness that interrupt unconscious habits. Before reaching for food, you drink water. Before reacting to a craving, you create a brief space. These moments may seem insignificant, but they accumulate into a pattern of control. You are no longer acting impulsively, you are responding deliberately. From a broader perspective, hydration represents something deeper than just a physical requirement. It reflects how well you take care of the basics. People often search for advanced strategies while neglecting foundational behaviors, but the body does not respond to complexity, it responds to consistency. And consistency begins with simple actions performed well, repeatedly without negotiation. So the question is not whether drinking more water will magically transform your body. It is whether you are willing to respect the simplest needs of your system with the same seriousness you give to more dramatic interventions. Because when the foundation is strong, everything built on top of it becomes more effective. And perhaps that is the real lesson here. Transformation does not always come from doing more. It often comes from finally doing the obvious properly. Once hydration, nutrition, and intention are in place, the body is prepared for the next essential demand, movement, not as punishment, not as a reaction to overeating, but as a fundamental expression of how the body is designed to function. Movement is not an accessory to weight loss, it is a requirement for it, and yet many people approach exercise with the same flawed mindset they bring to dieting. They either do too much too intensely or they do nothing at all. The first thing to understand is that the body responds to consistency far more than intensity. A single extreme workout does very little in isolation. What changes the body is repeated stimulus over time. This is where the idea of daily activity becomes important. Not necessarily hours in the gym, but a commitment to moving the body in a way that is structured, intentional, and sustained. Cardiovascular activity plays a direct role in energy expenditure. Walking, running, cycling, these are not just calorie-burning tools, they are mechanisms for improving how efficiently the body uses energy. When performed regularly, they enhance endurance, support heart health, and gradually increase the body's capacity to burn fat. But there is a mistake people often make here. They rely exclusively on cardio, believing that more sweat equals more results. The reality is more nuanced. Strength training introduces a different kind of adaptation. When you challenge your muscles, you are not just building strength, you are preserving lean tissue. And this matters because muscle is metabolically active. The more lean mass you maintain, the more efficiently your body burns energy, even at rest. Without strength training, rapid weight loss often leads to muscle loss, which slows metabolism and makes long-term maintenance more difficult. So, what appears to be progress can quietly undermine future stability. The balance then is not choosing between cardio and strength training, but integrating both. One supports immediate energy expenditure, the other supports long-term metabolic health. Together, they create a system where the body is not just losing weight, but becoming more capable, more resilient, more efficient. There is also an important psychological shift that needs to occur in how exercise is perceived. If movement is framed as an obligation, something you have to do to fix your body, it will always feel heavy. Resistance will build, excuses will form, and consistency will break. But when movement is reframed as a standard, a non-negotiable part of how you live, it becomes less emotional. You do not debate whether to brush your teeth, you simply do it. The same mindset can be applied to physical activity. Beyond structured workouts, there is another layer that is often underestimated: incidental movement. The way you move throughout the day, walking instead of sitting, taking stairs instead of elevators, staying physically engaged rather than passive, these small actions accumulate. They may not feel significant in the moment, but over weeks and months, they create a meaningful difference in energy expenditure. A person who remains generally active throughout the day will always have an advantage over someone who relies solely on isolated workout sessions. And then there is the matter of discipline, not motivation, because motivation is inconsistent by nature. Some days you will feel driven, other days you will not. If your behavior depends on how you feel, your results will always fluctuate. Discipline, on the other hand, removes that variability. It is the decision to act regardless of emotional state. This is where real transformation begins, not in moments of excitement, but in moments of resistance. It is also important to recognize that progress in physical activity is not always linear. Some days will feel strong, others will feel difficult. The body adapts at its own pace, but consistency ensures that even on less productive days, you are still moving forward. You are reinforcing a pattern, strengthening an identity, becoming someone who shows up regardless of circumstance, because ultimately, movement is not just about burning calories. It is about sending a message to your body that it is needed, that it is being used, that it must adapt and improve. And when that message is repeated often enough, the body responds. So the real question is not whether you are capable of intense workouts or perfect routines. It is whether you are willing to move consistently, even when it feels ordinary, even when it feels inconvenient. Because in the end, transformation does not come from what you do occasionally, it comes from what you refuse to stop doing. By this point, the structure is already in place. You have clarity in your goal, control over your nutrition, consistency in hydration, and a commitment to movement. From the outside, it might seem like everything necessary has been addressed, but there is a quieter, less visible layer that often determines whether all of this holds together or slowly unravels, and that is your relationship with rest and stress. Sleep, in particular, is not simply a period of inactivity. It is an active biological process where regulation occurs. Hormones recalibrate, tissues repair, and the nervous system resets. When sleep is compromised, the body does not just feel tired, it becomes dysregulated. Hunger hormones such as ghrelin increase, signaling you to eat more, while leptin, which signals fullness, decreases. The result is not just increased appetite, but a specific craving for high-calorie, energy-dense foods. In other words, lack of sleep subtly shifts your preferences in a direction that works against your goals. At the same time, poor sleep impacts decision-making. Cognitive clarity declines, impulse control weakens, and short-term gratification becomes more appealing than long-term benefit. This is why people often make their worst dietary decisions late at night or after a restless sleep, not because they lack knowledge, but because their mental state is compromised. The system that supports discipline is simply not functioning at its best. Stress operates in a similar way, though it is often less obvious. In small amounts, stress is useful. It sharpens focus, prepares the body for action. But when it becomes chronic, it begins to alter internal chemistry. Cortisol levels remain elevated, which encourages fat storage, particularly around the abdominal area. It also drives emotional eating, not out of physical hunger, but as a coping mechanism. Food becomes a temporary escape, a way to regulate feelings that have not been addressed directly. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They attempt to control their external behaviors, what they eat, how much they exercise, without addressing the internal conditions that influence those behaviors. It is like trying to maintain balance on unstable ground. Eventually, something gives. Managing sleep and stress is therefore not a secondary concern, it is a foundational requirement, but it does not require complexity. It begins with simple, deliberate actions. Creating a consistent sleep schedule, reducing screen exposure before bed, allowing the mind to slow down instead of constantly stimulating it. These are not dramatic changes, but they are effective. They signal to the body that it is safe to rest, that it does not need to remain in a heightened state of alertness. Stress management follows a similar principle. It is not about eliminating stress entirely. That is neither realistic nor necessary. It is about creating space between stimulus and response. Practices like quiet reflection, controlled breathing, or even a simple walk without distraction can interrupt the cycle of constant mental engagement. These moments create a kind of psychological distance, allowing you to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. There is also a deeper realization that emerges here. Many of the habits that lead to weight gain are not rooted in physical need, but in emotional discomfort. When people feel overwhelmed, uncertain, or mentally fatigued, they seek relief. and food, being immediate and accessible, becomes the default solution. But unless the underlying stress is acknowledged, the pattern continues. When you begin to manage stress and prioritize sleep, you are not just improving your physical state, you are changing the environment in which your decisions are made. You are giving yourself the clarity, stability, and control required to follow through on the habits you have already built. And that is the key point. Success in transformation is not just about doing the right things, but about creating the conditions that make doing the right things easier. Because in the end, the body does not break down from a lack of effort. It breaks down from a lack of recovery. At this stage, everything we've discussed begins to converge into a single defining principle. You can have the most effective diet, a well-structured exercise routine, proper hydration, and even adequate rest. But without consistency, none of it sustains. And this is where the conversation shifts from methods to mindset, from strategies to identity. Most people begin their transformation driven by motivation. There is a surge of energy, a moment of clarity, a strong emotional reason to change. And in that initial phase, everything feels possible. You wake up early, you eat clean, you train hard. But motivation, by its nature, is temporary. It is influenced by mood, environment, and circumstance. The moment life becomes inconvenient, when you are tired, stressed, or distracted, motivation fades. And if your system depends on it, your progress fades with it. Discipline operates differently. It is not emotional, it is structural. It does not ask how you feel before it acts. It is the decision, repeated daily, to follow through regardless of internal resistance. And this is not as harsh as it sounds. In fact, discipline, when properly understood, creates freedom. Because once a behavior becomes non-negotiable, you no longer spend energy debating it. You simply execute. There is a psychological relief in this. When every choice requires negotiation, should I work out today? Should I eat this or not? You create mental fatigue. Decision-making itself becomes exhausting. But when certain standards are fixed, that fatigue disappears. You conserve mental energy for more important areas of life. Discipline simplifies. This is also where identity begins to shift. Initially, you are someone trying to lose weight, but over time, through consistent action, you become someone who lives differently. You become a person who moves daily, who eats with awareness, who respects rest. And once that identity is formed, maintaining results is no longer a struggle. It is a natural extension of who you are. There is, however, an important nuance here. Consistency does not mean perfection. Many people abandon their progress not because they failed completely, but because they failed partially and interpreted it as total failure. They miss a workout, they eat something outside their plan, and they conclude that the process is broken. This is a misunderstanding of how progress works. Consistency is not about never deviating, it is about returning quickly. It is the ability to absorb small disruptions without losing direction. One imperfect meal does not undo your progress, just as one perfect meal does not create it. What matters is the pattern over time. The longer you stay engaged in the process, the less impact individual mistakes have. Tracking progress can support this mindset, but it must be approached intelligently. The scale, for example, is only one metric. It fluctuates due to water retention, digestion, and other variables. If you rely on it exclusively, you may become discouraged even when real progress is occurring. A more grounded approach is to observe trends rather than daily changes, to combine objective measures with subjective ones, how you feel, how you move, how your habits are stabilizing. There is also a deeper philosophical dimension to consistency. It is, in many ways, a form of self-respect. When you follow through on your commitments, even when they are inconvenient, you reinforce a belief in your own reliability. You begin to trust yourself, and that trust extends beyond weight loss. It influences how you approach challenges in every area of life. Because ultimately, this process is not just about reducing a number on a scale. It is about building a system of behavior that supports who you want to become. And systems are not built in moments of intensity. They are built in moments of repetition. So the question is not whether you will feel motivated tomorrow. The question is whether you have decided who you are and whether your actions are aligned with that decision. Because in the end, results are not created by what you do occasionally. They are created by what you are willing to repeat long after the excitement is gone.